Hey, how's it going? It's been a while since I've done these solo videos, and as you can see, I set up a dedicated channel for them. So from here on out, all the solo videos are going to be on this channel, and the old channel is just going to be dedicated to the roundtables. And so, yeah, just wanted to announce that first of all. And secondly, I wanted to talk about the situation here in Ukraine. Now, it's really apparent, several people are saying this, and I agree with this analysis, that we're about to hit a turning point, a major turning point in this conflict. The turning point is that several things are happening simultaneously here in Ukraine, and they all point to, well, just a big, big change. Because you heard, a couple of weeks ago, what was it? That the Russians mobilized, they say, 300,000 men. I actually think it was probably a lot more, but that's not really important. They mobilized 1/3 men. Now, of course, it's not that they pulled these people out of civilian life and they're going to throw them to the front. No, they pulled them out of civilian life and they're going to put them in other positions in the Russian army so that from those other positions they can pull out the combat troops to position in Ukraine. Now, if you've been following this war so far, you know that right now there's a big battle going on for the town of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. Now, this town is fortified, and there are approximately 30,000 Zelensky regime forces there. And that town is about to be overrun by the Russians. They've been pounding the hell out of it for several weeks now. And they're getting there, that they're about to take it over. And the Zelensky regime, apparently on orders from Washington, rather than pulling out of Bakhmut and setting up a better defensive position, they're holding on. It's becoming their last stand. At the same time, the Ukraine forces have gathered somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 men. Estimates vary. I don't think it's 60,000, because those figures of 60,000 and 50,000, they seem to be more from NATO cheerleaders as opposed to people who are actually with better information. It seems more likely around 30 to 40,000. But again, it doesn't really matter. The point is, this other grouping is about to make a major push for the city of Kherson. Now, the Western media has been going on and on and on about the fact that the Russians told civilians in Kherson, in the city of Kherson, to evacuate. And that's led many to think that the Russians are going to give up that city. No, they're not going to give it up. They know what's going to happen to Kherson. The city of Kherson is going to be leveled because that force of 30,000 men that the Ukrainians have there in front of them, they're going to do everything in their power to reach the city of Kherson. And of course, that's going to mean a lot of artillery that's just going to decimate the city. But the Russians aren't going to give it up. They've already positioned a sizable grouping of men of their own right behind Kherson. Again, estimates vary, but it seems to be on the magnitude of about 100,000 men. Be that as it may, it seems that the Zelensky regime is going for a final two-front push towards both Bakhmut and Kherson. They don't have any more troops. The original professional army that they had at the beginning of this conflict, that's gone. Credible estimates put the number of killed at about 100,000 men, and probably twice that number of wounded, incapacitated. So that's 300,000 men that the Ukrainians no longer have. And so the men that they're deploying now, they're basically two groups, either recent conscripts or foreign fighters. And there aren't that many of those. Now, those are the people who are going to be attacking Kherson. And those are the people holding on at Bakhmut. And the Russians are getting ready to overrun Bakhmut. And they are going to do very well insofar as this offensive by the Zelensky regime forces against Kherson. Because the Russians are dug in. And this has been a consistent strategy of the Russians. They have a defensive position, and they just let the Zelensky regime attack them. And as they stretch out to attack, the Russians use their artillery to just level and kill all those men who are attacking. And this has been the consistent strategy, or tactic rather, that the Russians have been employing throughout this war. A lot of people say, well, what about Kharkov? They won Kharkov. The Zelensky regime won Kharkov. Yeah, but at what cost? And more importantly, how many men did the Russians lose? Credible estimates, it was a 10-to-1 ratio. And in the end, the Zelensky regime, all they wound up with was with cow country. Just open fields of no value. Because remember, it's not the territory that you capture that matters. It's how many of the opposing forces you destroy. That's how you win wars, okay? If you have territory, but you can't defend it, it's pointless. But the Zelensky regime, being pushed by NATO, by people in NATO who obviously never read Clausewitz, they do not know what they're doing, they've been throwing men pointlessly into this meat grinder. That's what Bakhmut is. That's what this Kherson offensive is going to become. But there's another factor that's in play. Something is brewing in Belarus. The Russians put 10,000 men, but what was important is that those 10,000 men that they put there were not just troops. No, they were command and control people. That is the top echelon that you put before you assemble a big force. And nobody knows exactly right now how many men, fighters, the Russians actually have in Belarus. The Zelensky regime is going to throw everything at Bakhmut, everything at Kherson. There are going to be attacks on Zaporozhye. There have been that already, but they've been ineffective. In fact, all of the initial lunges at Kherson have also been ineffective. We're getting to a tipping point, a turning point, a break. Because remember, see, the Russians, during this whole time, they've been hoping for negotiations. But when Dmitry Medvedev, who was previously president and is in a high position in the Russian Security Council, I believe he's the secretary of it, well, he has said openly that the Russians want to demilitarize Ukraine, denazify, as I said from the very beginning, but now they've also said that they want regime change. They are not going to negotiate with the Zelensky regime. In other words, the gloves are coming off. And a lot of very intelligent commentators, many of whom I agree with wholeheartedly on many issues, they think that the Russians are going to wait until mid-November because at this time, there's a lot of rain going on, the ground gets very soft, very muddy, and it's very easy for tanks to get entrapped in that muddy terrain. But I think that won't really matter. I think that the Russians, they're going to really do something. Now, what is it going to be exactly? I don't know how it's going to play out. Are the forces in Belarus just a fixing operation, or are they going to use it to encircle Kiev? I don't know. But something's coming up. There's just a lot of little data points that point to the Russians doing something major. You heard, how a few days ago, after the Kerch Bridge bombing, that the Russians started shelling all of Ukraine with missile strikes across the whole country. And people in the West have sort of forgotten that, as if it had died down. It hasn't died down. It's been at that consistent pace. And the thing is, see, the Russians, unlike the Kiev regime forces and unlike NATO, they got plenty of gear. They got plenty of missiles, plenty of artillery shells. They got all the gear necessary to keep on going. Somebody did an estimate the other day, and they said that if the Russians decided to continue striking with their missiles at the pace that they are currently at, They could go uninterrupted every day for the next 6 months. That's how many missiles they've got, the kind of missiles that are hitting targets. It seems that the Russians are stepping it up. And it seems that right now, as you are watching this video, it's coming on. It's coming on a big way. How it's going to play out after this big Russian offensive, because that's what I'm basically saying. I think that the Russians are going to absorb the offensive at Kherson and immediately launch a counterattack. And it's going to be huge. It's going to be a huge counterattack on all fronts and on Kiev or the regions of northern Ukraine. Again, I don't quite know how it's going to be because there are a lot of different clues, a lot of different data points. A lot of people are saying that a Belarusian offensive is going to be far further west than Kiev. It could be. And there are a lot of, like I say, different data points that point in that direction. There are other data points that say that no, they're going to go to surround Kiev and hit Chuhuyev, as they did at the beginning of the war back in February. But unlike that operation, where it was really trying to intimidate the Zelensky regime into a quick negotiation, this time, the offensive, if it hits Kiev, it's going for broke. Do keep in mind that with these missile strikes, between a third and half the country is without electricity. It's somewhat of a minor miracle that here in Kharkov there is electricity and obviously internet. But it seems that we're hitting this tipping point, this turning point, this decisive break. The Russians are going to be taking off the gloves now. I think that the next 2 weeks are going to be extraordinary. Now is the time that you should be paying attention to the minutiae of the war. There are lots of very good channels that do this. I follow two in particular, Military Summary Channel and Weeb, I forget the name of the guy. I'll put links in the description below. But the minutiae, it's important, sure, but you have to look at the overall picture. The macro picture, stepping back, because this is a war between NATO and Russia. The battleground is Ukraine. But the war is between NATO and Russia. And if Russia really steps it up, really goes to the fullest extent that they possibly can, which they have not done so far, when they really step it up now, what's important is what NATO's reaction is going to be. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, he said openly last week that the Russian victory would be a defeat for NATO. At least he was stupid to have said that, but they know what's going on. This is really a NATO war against Russia. And if Russia just simply overwhelms all of Ukraine, as it seems as it's about to do, the question becomes, what will NATO do? Will they go nuclear? I put the odds at 6 and 10 that NATO, when they see this overwhelming attack by the Russians, because the Kiev regime forces are exhausted, depleted, they're begging for weapons, tanks, anything from the West, because they're out of gas, they're out of bullets, they're out of everything. They don't have any planes in the sky. It's over for the Kiev regime. That's why they're panicking. And the Russians, with this influx of 300,000 men, it's pretty obvious what's about to happen. And so the question becomes, will NATO go nuclear? Will they, in the panic of seeing the catastrophic loss of Ukraine, of all of Ukraine, because the Russians are going to take the whole thing, the whole enchilada, what will NATO do? What will the United States do? What will these psychopaths in Washington and Foggy Bottom do? I don't think it's going to be pretty. And like I said, I think it's 6 in 10 chance that they decide to use a nuclear weapon. in their panic, in their desperation. All of a sudden, all the nonsense that they've been saying for weeks and months now about how the Kiev regime is winning, well, it's going to be shown up to be a complete and utter lie. It's going to get ugly. It's about to get really ugly. Know what's going on.